I always knew my family carried tension the way other families carried heirlooms, but nothing prepared me for how sharp the atmosphere became once my grandmother's health started slipping. Marisol Cruz had been the rock of our family for as long as I could remember, and even in her late 80s, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made people soften around her. I visited her every day after my nursing shifts, helping her to bed, brushing her silver hair, and listening to her stories about the old neighborhood. She'd raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 3, and every time she took my hand, I felt the warmth of a love no one else in the family ever offered me. But as she got weaker, everyone else suddenly became very interested in her time, her belongings, and most of all, her will. The worst of them was my cousin Derek. We were the same age, but he had grown up entitled, mean-spirited, and convinced the world owed him something simply because he existed. Derek had always resented the way our grandmother doted on me, though she never treated him poorly. His jealousy simmered under every comment he made, especially in recent weeks when he started showing up at the house more than usual. He claimed he was helping, but mostly I saw him hovering around the study, rifling through paperwork when he thought no one was looking. The sight always left a cold knot in my stomach. One evening, when I came by the house after work, I found the atmosphere colder than usual. My Aunt Lydia and Uncle Ramon were seated in the living room with Derek, their heads huddled close together as if they were part of some secret society. The moment I entered, their conversation abruptly stopped, and their eyes landed on me with tight, evaluative expressions. My aunt managed a stiff smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes, while Derek smirked in a way that made my skin prickle. It was the same expression he wore whenever he felt superior, usually right before he caused trouble. I tried to shake it off as I climbed the stairs to my grandmother's room, but even the hallway felt different, like the house itself sensed something shifting beneath its foundation. When I opened her door, she was sitting up in bed, her frail figure illuminated by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Her eyes brightened when she saw me, and she reached out with a thin, trembling hand. The tender moment calmed me for a breath, but beneath her smile, I saw exhaustion more than usual, and I wondered if Derek and his parents had said something upsetting to her. As I helped her settle back onto her pillows, she squeezed my wrist gently and whispered, "Don't let them get to you, Corazon." Her voice was weak, but her gaze held familiar fire. I asked her what she meant, but she shook her head slowly, saying she was too tired to talk. I didn't push her. I could tell speaking was draining her, and I didn't want to cause her discomfort. But those words followed me all the way downstairs like a warning I didn't yet know how to interpret. When I returned to the living room, Derek stretched lazily across the couch, wearing the smug satisfaction of someone who believed the world was tilting in his favor. My aunt was whispering something to him, but she snapped her mouth shut when I approached. Derek's smirk widened as he stood, brushing invisible dust off his designer jeans. He made a show of patting my shoulder, as if consoling a child, and said in a syrupy tone, "You know, Bella, things are going to look different soon. Might be time to get your life in order." His voice dripped with condescension, and my pulse quickened with unease. I wanted to demand, he explained, but I knew engaging him would only fuel his ego. Instead, I offered a tight-lipped smile and told them good night before heading outside into the chilly evening air. The breeze brushed against my face as I inhaled deeply, trying to calm the jittery dread spreading through my chest. I had no idea what Derek was insinuating, but his confidence was unsettling. It wasn't like him to gamble without being certain the odds were stacked in his favor. As I walked to my car, passing the shadowed windows of the house I'd grown up in, I paused when I heard faint voices drifting from the dining room. Curiosity pulled me closer, and I slowed my steps, leaning just slightly toward the open window. Derek's voice came through first, low and self-satisfied, saying words that made my blood run cold. "Relax," he told someone inside. "Everything is already taken care of." And in that moment, dread settled deep into my bones, because whatever he was talking about, it wasn't good. The next few days felt like pushing through a fog that only thickened every time I stepped foot inside my grandmother's house. Derek and his parents had practically moved in by then, acting as though they were the sole decision-makers while treating me like some distant relative with no real claim to anything. Every time I arrived after my shift, I found them hovering around Grandma's attorney, Mr. Gilmore, who had suddenly begun visiting far more frequently. He'd been the family lawyer for years, a rigid man with a trimmed beard and a distracted, dismissive demeanor. But lately he seemed almost glued to Derek's side. The two of them exchanged too many whispers, too many glances, and each one chipped away at the uneasy calm I tried desperately to maintain. One afternoon, after helping my grandmother eat a small bowl of soup, I walked downstairs to find Derek standing in the kitchen with a stack of papers tucked under his arm. His expression shifted the moment he saw me tightening with irritation, as though my very presence interfered with some private operation he'd been conducting. Before I could ask what he was doing, he snapped that it was family business, implying I somehow wasn't included in that definition. The casual cruelty in his tone hit harder than I expected, stirring something between anger and fear deep inside my chest. I forced myself not to react as he brushed past me, papers clutched tightly like stolen treasure. That evening, we held what was supposed to be a family dinner, though it felt more like an interrogation. Aunt Lydia insisted on setting the table with the good china, claiming it was important to maintain dignity during difficult times. Derek sat at the head of the table despite having no right to do so, and both his parents acted as though this arrangement were perfectly normal. I sat quietly, trying to stomach the dry chicken and force conversation, but every time I tried to speak, Derek cut me off with passive-aggressive comments or suspiciously loud sighs. It dawned on me, somewhere between the salad and the main course, that the shift wasn't accidental. Derek was intentionally isolating me. The breaking point came when Aunt Lydia raised a glass and toasted to family unity moving forward, her eyes flicking toward me with a forced sympathy that felt like a slap. Derek leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine with all the arrogance of a man who believed he had already won some invisible contest. He smirked at me across the table and murmured, "Some of us are more fortunate than others when it comes to legacies." My jaw tightened, and heat crept up my neck. But before I could ask him what he meant, he changed the subject, leaving the implication to fester like a wound. The next day, everything snapped into place. I had arrived at the house early, hoping to spend more time with my grandmother before my shift. As I stepped into the living room, I stopped short. Mr. Gilmore stood beside Derek and his parents, holding a thin folder with a severity that made my stomach churn. Derek glanced at me with a poorly contained smirk as Miss Gilmore cleared his throat and announced, almost casually, that Marisol had updated her will. According to him, the revision placed Derek as the primary beneficiary of her estate. It felt like the floor dropped out beneath me. I stared at Mr. Gilmore, searching his face for some sign this was a misunderstanding or cruel joke, but he avoided my eyes entirely. My voice trembled when I asked how that could be possible, especially since my grandmother had told me she wasn't planning any changes. Derek wasted no time swooping in with a disgustingly rehearsed explanation, claiming Grandma had expressed concerns about my financial instability and decided he was better equipped to manage the estate. I felt nauseous hearing those words, each one dripping with deceit. When I demanded to speak to my grandmother myself, Derek's mother stepped forward like a guard dog, claiming she was resting and shouldn't be disturbed. The anger in my chest ignited then, burning hotter than fear, frustration, or grief. I turned to Mr. Gilmore and insisted I see the document. He refused, citing privacy and claiming I had no legal standing to question it. Something in his voice, something shaky and unnatural, made the hair on the back of my neck rise. Still, I dug deep, trying to stay composed, but a storm of questions roared inside my head. Had they manipulated her? Had they pressured her? Or worse, had they forged something? When I left the room, I felt Derek's eyes following me, amused and confident, as if the game were already over. But he didn't know what I knew. Because that morning, before anyone else had arrived, a letter had been waiting for me at my apartment. A letter written in my grandmother's handwriting from a week before the supposed will change. And the final line trembled through my mind like an omen. "There is something you need to know about who you really are." I sat in my car for nearly 10 minutes after leaving my grandmother's house, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. The world outside felt muted, like sounds couldn't quite reach me through the haze of betrayal swirling in my head. Derek's smirk, Mr. Gilmore's evasiveness, and Aunt Lydia's false sweetness replayed over and over until each memory felt like a needle pricking at my composure. I wanted to scream, to storm back inside and demand answers, but something held me back. The truth was that the letter in my bag weighed more heavily than any anger I felt toward them. When I finally returned to my apartment that afternoon, I walked straight to the kitchen table where I'd left the envelope earlier. It lay untouched, soft at the edges, and yellowed just slightly, as though my grandmother had kept it hidden somewhere for a long time. Her handwriting slanted, elegant, unmistakably hers spelled out my name with such care that my throat tightened. I traced the letters with my thumb, remembering the afternoons she would guide my hand when I was little, teaching me how to write cursive. A part of me almost didn't want to open it, afraid of whatever revelation waited inside. But curiosity and dread won in the end. I slid my finger under the seal and unfolded the letter with hands that trembled more than I wanted to admit. The first few lines were sweet, familiar, and filled with affection, as though she had written them on a quiet morning while sipping her rosehip tea. But the tone shifted sharply halfway down the page, the writing becoming more urgent, less polished, almost as if her hand had begun shaking while she wrote. My eyes widened as I read her next words, the ones she must have chosen so carefully. There are things you were never told about your father, and I fear others may try to use that truth against you. My breath caught. She wrote that shortly before my father passed, he confided in her something that he never got the chance to share with me. He had apparently learned that certain relatives, not named directly, but strongly implied, were attempting to manipulate the inheritance laws within the family. My grandmother explained that she had updated her will after his death to ensure that what he wanted for me would be protected. But the letter ended with something far more shocking, something that made my pulse pound in my ears. She wrote that she had left documentation with her attorney in a sealed envelope to be delivered to me only upon her passing, and that the contents were vital to my legal rights. A cold dread spread through me as I remembered the sight of Mr. Gilmore standing in the living room with Derek earlier that day. If those documents were supposed to be delivered to me, why hadn't he even mentioned them? And worse, what if Derek already knew about their existence? The realization hit me like a wave crashing against stone. If they were trying to cut me out of the will, those documents might be the very thing that prevented them from doing it. The possibility that they might have already gotten their hands on them made my stomach twist painfully. I paced around my apartment for several minutes, unable to sit still. Every instinct told me I needed help. Someone impartial and qualified, someone who wasn't tangled up in the family politics. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number of an attorney I had worked with briefly through a nonprofit job years ago, a woman named Alicia Barrett. She had always struck me as sharp, fair, and unafraid to stand up to intimidation. When she answered after a few rings, her voice calm and steady, I felt a flicker of relief. I explained the situation in careful detail, from Derek's sudden involvement to the suspicious will update and finally the letter I'd received. Alicia listened quietly, occasionally stopping me to clarify a detail or ask for dates. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end. She finally told me that everything I described was extremely irregular and likely illegal if certain steps had been skipped or documents tampered with. She asked me to send her a scanned copy of the letter immediately and scheduled an in-person meeting for the next morning. Her confidence steadied me in a way I hadn't realized I needed, as though the chaos swirling around me finally had something solid to anchor itself to. After hanging up, I sank onto the couch and closed my eyes, letting the quiet fill the room. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope, small, fragile, but real. If there truly was a sealed envelope meant for me, and if Mr. Gilmore had failed to deliver it, then something far bigger was happening behind the scenes. And Derek, who strutted around with the arrogance of a man who thought he'd already secured victory, had no idea that everything he was building might be about to collapse, because the letter hinted at something he could never have anticipated. Not just inheritance, not just money, but bloodlines, and the truth about who legally belonged to this family estate. And in the quiet of my apartment, I whispered to myself a promise. Whatever they were hiding, I would uncover it. The next morning, I woke up long before my alarm, my mind already racing through worst-case scenarios. There was a sickening mixture of fear and determination inside me, swirling so intensely that even my coffee tasted muted. I kept replaying Derek's smug expression from the family meeting, imagining how confident he must feel right now, believing he had everything under control. That thought alone made something harden inside me, a resolve I hadn't felt in years. If Alicia was right, and if the letter hinted at a deeper truth, then I was walking straight into a storm, but this time I wasn't going to let it drown me. When I arrived at Alicia's office, she greeted me with a firm handshake and perceptive eyes that made me feel seen in a way I desperately needed. Her office smelled faintly of citrus and old books, a strangely comforting combination that helped steady the shaking in my hands. She ushered me into a leather chair and set the printed copy of my grandmother's letter on the table between us, treating it like evidence in a criminal case. She had already highlighted several lines in yellow, especially the ones implying hidden documentation and potential coercion. As she folded her hands, she told me there was something I needed to prepare myself for. She explained that if a sealed envelope existed but had never been delivered to me, the most likely explanation was that someone intercepted it. The only person with both access and motive was the estate attorney himself. Hearing her say the words out loud sent a chill through me, like the room suddenly dropped several degrees. I had always trusted Mr. Gilmore. He'd been my grandparents' attorney for decades, but the image of him standing with Derek now took on an entirely different shade. Alicia added that she had already reached out to the county registrar to verify whether any updated wills had been filed without proper documentation, and what she found was concerning. She revealed that my grandmother's will had been amended only 5 weeks before her death, with a version that drastically shifted the majority of the estate to Derek. But the signature on the amendment looked inconsistent with her usual penmanship. The moment she showed me the copy, my stomach tightened into a painful knot. The strokes were shakier, the loops uneven, nothing like the graceful handwriting I'd seen all my life. Alicia met my eyes and said plainly that forgery was not out of the question. I felt a rush of anger so fierce it made my chest burn. But right beneath it was a guilt that hit me even harder. Why hadn't I visited more often during those last few months? Why had I assumed everything was fine just because her voice over the phone sounded strong? Alicia must have seen the turmoil on my face because she leaned forward and said that none of this was my fault. People like Derek thrived on proximity and manipulation, slipping into positions of trust when others weren't looking. Hearing her say it didn't erase the guilt entirely, but it made the weight of it more bearable. Alicia told me that before we took any legal action, we needed to confront the attorney directly and request the sealed envelope referenced in the letter. Not aggressively, not emotionally, but formally, and on the record so he couldn't claim ignorance later. She suggested that we pay him a visit today. The suddenness of it made my pulse spike, but I nodded anyway. I had been waiting for answers for too long, and the idea of finally cornering the truth made my fear feel almost irrelevant. We drove together to the old-fashioned brick building where Mr. Gilmore's practice was located, a place that had always seemed warm and respectable to me. Now, however, it felt like walking into a hunter's den. The waiting room was quiet, just the soft hum of an air purifier and the faint scent of cinnamon potpourri. The receptionist looked surprised when she saw me, but even more confused when she noticed Alicia at my side. She stammered something about Mr. Gilmore being in a meeting, but Alicia's voice turned sharp, professional, and insistent as she handed over her business card. Minutes later, we were ushered into his office. Mr. Gilmore stood behind his desk, flustered, his glasses slightly askew, as though he'd put them on in a hurry. He greeted me with strained politeness, but his eyes flickered nervously toward Alicia. When she introduced herself as my legal counsel and requested the sealed envelope referenced in my grandmother's handwritten letter, the color drained subtly from his face. He claimed not to know what she was talking about, but Alicia calmly placed the printed letter on his desk, tapping the relevant paragraph with her pen. A thick tension settled into the room, the kind that makes even the sound of breathing feel loud. Mr. Gilmore hesitated, swallowing hard, and adjusted his tie repeatedly like it was strangling him. He insisted he had followed all standard procedures, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. I watched him closely, searching his expression for cracks, for guilt, for fear, and I found all of it. Then Alicia asked a question that made him freeze entirely. She asked whether Derek had been present during any updates or signings of the will in the last year of my grandmother's life. Mr. Gilmore didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation was all we needed to know that something was terribly, dangerously wrong. Mr. Gilmore's hesitation stretched out for so long I could hear the clock ticking behind him, its rhythm steady and accusing. His eyes darted between me and Alicia before he finally sank into his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He rubbed his forehead slowly, like he was trying to erase the truth before it reached his mouth. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and exhausted. The voice of a man who'd been carrying a secret far too long. He admitted that Derek had become involved in estate discussions near the end, but quickly insisted it was my grandmother's choice, an explanation even he didn't seem to believe. Alicia didn't give him time to build a story. She asked directly whether Derek had brought him documents to sign or amend without my grandmother present. He flinched, and that tiny movement was more damning than any confession. My stomach twisted as I watched him squirm, guilt settling like a heavy fog around him. Seeing him like this, the attorney my family had trusted for generations, made my skin crawl. It wasn't just betrayal. It was betrayal committed with a polite smile and steady hands. He finally whispered that Derek had pressured him, showing up repeatedly, insisting that my grandmother wanted things done differently. At first, he resisted, but when Derek brought in a document with what he claimed was her signature, Gilmore said he felt trapped. He knew something was wrong. He could see the signature wasn't right, but Derek promised it was verified and that my grandmother didn't want to stress me with legal details. Hearing that excuse made rage pulse through me like a heartbeat. My grandmother had never hidden anything from me, especially not something this important. Alicia leaned forward and asked a question so calm it made the room go still. Did he have the sealed envelope mentioned in the letter? The man's shoulders slumped, and his eyes closed like he was bracing for impact. He stood shakily, walked to a locked cabinet in the corner, and pulled out a small beige envelope with my name written on it. My breath caught in my throat as he placed it on the desk in front of me. Everything inside me went silent except for the pounding in my chest as I picked it up. I opened it with trembling fingers while Alicia watched closely, her expression unreadable. Inside was a notarized addendum signed months before my grandmother's death, one with a steady, unmistakably authentic signature. It explicitly stated that I was to inherit the house, a portion of her savings, and all sentimental family heirlooms. Even more importantly, it stated that Derek was not to be trusted with any part of the estate due to past behavioral concerns. Reading that line sent a flash of shock through me. My grandmother had tried to warn me even then, trying to protect me long before I suspected anything. But the document wasn't the only thing inside. There was also a folded DNA report dated 2 years ago, revealing something far more explosive. Derek wasn't biologically related to my grandmother at all. My Aunt Lydia had adopted him secretly before marrying into the family, but she'd never told anyone, not even my grandmother, until she ran her own tests. My grandmother wrote a note explaining that she didn't judge Derek, but she feared Lydia and Derek would use underhanded tactics to take control of the estate. The letter ended with a plea for me to stay strong if the truth ever came to light. I felt dizzy as everything clicked into place. Derek's entitlement, his aggression, his desperation. He had been trying to secure a future that wasn't his to begin with. Alicia let out a slow breath and told Mr. Gilmore that this was grounds for legal action on multiple fronts: fraud, coercion, concealment of crucial documents, and conspiracy. The attorney buried his face in his hands, whispering apologies that felt too late to matter. Alicia calmly informed him that he would need to give a full recorded statement or face immediate legal consequences. Later that week, a formal hearing was scheduled, and Alicia insisted I attend not just as a beneficiary but as a witness. Derek walked into the room with the same smug swagger he always had. But the moment he saw the DNA results displayed on the monitor, his face drained of color. His eyes darted wildly around the room, as though searching for an escape route. When Mr. Gilmore delivered his sworn testimony, admitting Derek pressured him into filing forged documents, Derek's composure fractured completely. His hands shook, his jaw clenched, and whatever arrogance he had walked in with evaporated like smoke. Aunt Lydia tried to defend him, insisting the family didn't need outsiders meddling. But Alicia simply slid the notarized addendum toward the judge, along with the recorded statement and the sealed envelope's chain of custody. Watching Lydia's expression shift from confidence to horror felt like reclaiming something I didn't even know I'd lost. For once, they couldn't talk over me, manipulate the room, or twist the narrative to paint me as the problem. The facts were undeniable, and the truth was finally loud enough to drown out their lies. When the ruling came down, it felt surreal. The forged amendment was invalidated, the real will reinstated, and disciplinary action was initiated against both Derek and Mr. Gilmore. In the hallway outside the courtroom, I finally exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. Alicia placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder and told me that justice, no matter how delayed, still mattered. I nodded, feeling the weight of everything I'd endured gradually lift from my chest. That night, as I stood in my grandmother's old house, the house she had wanted me to have, I felt a warmth settle through me, gentle and steady. The windows glowed with the late sun, and for a brief moment, I almost swore I could smell her rose-hip tea. Derek had tried to erase me from the family legacy, but in the end, the truth had done what it always does. It had brought everything and everyone into the light, where they finally belong.